Uh, Today I'm talking about promising practice that I've identified for online learning, online teaching, and that promising practice is video feedback. Okay, and so when we as teachers provide feedback, our this is what we want our students to be able to do with that feedback. We want them to be able to use it to soar, to have it be the wind under their wings in which they fly to great heights. However, if you're a teacher who's ever provided feedback to a student, which I assume we all are, then we know that that's not always what happens with feedback. A lot of times with feedback, it can be discouraging to a student, or it can be confusing to a student. And that's just in the in-person classroom when the student has a relationship with you. When a student is in an online class, engaged in online learning from an online instructor, uh, it's it increases the chances that that feedback is going to be either not helpful or confusing to the student, discouraging or confusing to the student because uh, of reasons that we'll look at here. So the first question we're going to kind of tackle, we're going to tackle four questions today. The first question is, why is good feedback important? We want this image for our students, that the feedback is the air under their wings that allows them to fly to new and great heights. But it's not just giving feedback that makes that happen, as we've seen in our professional career. It requires good feedback to get them there. Okay? And so this is a quote that actually starts off this book, How to Give Effective Feedback to Your Students, by Susan M. Brookhart. Um, it's an ASCD book. Uh, Susan says, feedback says to a student, somebody cared enough about my work to read it and think about it. Most teachers want to be that somebody. I don't know about you, but I'd fall into that category of most teachers. I want to be that somebody, and somebody cared. Somebody cared. Students are coming from places oftentimes where nobody cares, or that they feel like nobody cares, especially if they're in that secondary level. Students will feel like nobody cares a lot of times, that their parents don't care, that no adult in their life cares, and they turn to things that they think actually care about them, or people they think actually care about them that don't. And so as a teacher, I want to be that somebody who cares. Okay, I want to be that somebody who cares. And so good feedback is important, aligning with that quote, for three reasons. First, good feedback builds trust. Good feedback builds trust, but it not only builds trust, it's based in trust. And, I just said feedback builds trust. Feedback is based in trust, but really it's important. Good feedback builds trust. Good feedback is also based on trust. And so you can see how new feedback would build on old feedback. Okay? New feedback would build on old feedback. We know that trust is the basis for a strong and meaningful relationship, and so you're going to hear that word multiple times. Relationship. Good feedback builds trust. Good feedback is based on trust, and it's obviously in relationship. And it's incredible that good feedback actually empowers students. Good feedback empowers students. What feedback does is that it brings clarity to a student's learning. Good feedback brings clarity to a student's learning. And so they're empowered because they have the opportunity to take control of their learning, so long as there's an opportunity to use that feedback. Patrick Lencioni would say in his book, The Advantage, that when we can have clarity, and then when we can bring more clarity, and more clarity. He says it. He says it this way, kind of summarizing in the chapters of his book, that one of the advantages that great organizations experience is that first they create clarity, then they over communicate clarity, and then they reinforce clarity. That's what feedback has the opportunity to do for a student to bring clarity, to reinforce that clarity, and that empowers the student to take control of their learning. That gives them, as Lencioni would say, that advantage, that organizational advantage that can be brought into the classroom as well for the student. And so they're empowered because they have great clarity. So providing good feedback is important, but why is it important for online learning? Okay, why is it important for online learning? Aaron Hansen from Solution Tree presented at a conference in my district in February 2020, and he said this quote, and I was able to capture it in writing. He said, "Deep learning is vested in relationships." Deep learning is vested in relationships. In the first question, we began to realize that feedback both is based on trust and builds trust when it's good. Good feedback does that. And trust is this building block for relationship. Trust is this building block for relationship. And so feedback enables deep learning is kind of what you're seeing reading between the lines there. So why is feedback important for online learning? Again, feedback builds trust and it brings clarity to learning, like I was talking about what Lencioni says. But this is what it's important to remember, that good feedback is not about how the student did on an assessment or on a paper or on a piece of work, but it's not about the performance of the student, but it's good feedback is for their learning. Good feedback is for their learning. It's to be used to help them learn, not to be just only looking back at how they've already done. It should be looking forward to. Okay, so online feedback, or feedback for online learning, is particularly important because without feedback, there's no opportunity to continually be building trust throughout the course. Okay, you might typically will do an introductory get to know you discussion at the beginning, and then without that feedback, there are little to no opportunities to continue to build trust and to create relationship for deep learning to happen in after that initial post. And so feedback is crucial for that in online learning. Question 3, how can I train my students to utilize the feedback that they've received? Excuse me, I don't know about you, but I found early in my career when I would give students feedback, they wouldn't know what to do with it. They'd have to ask me a bunch of questions. They would be confused by it. Many students would ask me, because my feedback was always in the form of a question, many students would ask me, why do I have to answer this question? I already answered the question that was on the assessment. And so I've had to teach my students how to use feedback. I love this guy, Peter Mathiasen. He's from the University of Agder in Norway. He said that students actively use their teacher's comments and acquire a strong emotional bond with him or her as well, talking about through feedback, through teacher feedback on student work. And so the students actively use the teacher's comments, and through those comments, they acquire a stronger emotional bond with him or her as well. Now, what's important there is that bond, that, again, it's that building of relationships. The comments can do this, but it does not specify what sort of emotion is being bonded there. And so I think it's very important to be careful with what sort of emotion students are attaching to you. And so you need to be able to train them to use that feedback. You don't want them to be discouraged by the feedback. You don't want them to be confused by the feedback. So how can I train my students to utilize the feedback they receive? First, I think it's important to cast vision about why are they going to be receiving feedback. What will the feedback be pointing them to do? Oftentimes students see the feedback and they think to the past. They think about what they just did on this piece of work that's feedback was being given for. And they fail to look towards the future and think, how can I learn from this piece of feedback? And so casting vision on not just what the feedback is about in the past, but how it can be used for the future. Second, it's important to allow class time to utilize feedback. I put class time in quotation marks because in a physical class, I would take physical, in-person, embodied time to teach them how to use this feedback and give them an opportunity to use it. However, in an online course, there isn't that, obviously, that class time, but I think it's important to devote time that would otherwise be used for instruction to allowing students to understand their feedback. And so if that's like an office hours type thing or a happy hour type thing, as Dr. Dave has done, where students have opportunity to come and discuss questions about their feedback, or maybe not even an opportunity, but an expectation to come and talk about feedback with the professor. That would be, or with the instructor, that would be kind of a way to utilize class time to understand that feedback. Another thing might be even to have students kind of pair up and share the feedback they received with one another and what they are learning from it. If they can kind of teach someone else about their feedback, then that's really a powerful tool. But utilizing that time that would otherwise be used for instruction, that class time, is super important there. And then the third thing is to create tools and models to help students understand their feedback. I've created reflection handouts for students to be able to use their feedback, to be able to self-reflect on how they did, consider the feedback that I've provided them, and then reflect again on how I might have interpreted what they did, and then what can they do different in the future based on the feedback. And so utilizing that feedback is super important. Finally, the fourth question here: how can I maximize the relational output of the feedback I provide? Aaron Hansen said feedback happens in learning happens in vested relationship. And so we need to, not only is feedback an opportunity to build a relationship, but how can we maximize the output, the relational output that comes from the feedback that we provide? And this is where we begin thinking of moving from written feedback to this video feedback. Okay, I love this. This is from a book called Faith for Exiles. The subtitle of that book is 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. The idea of digital Babylon is that because we're in a more digital age now with less interpersonal communication, where we're communicating through screens and where we live our life interpreted through screens a lot of times, what happens to us is that we end up, although we're more connected than ever, we end up feeling more alone than we ever have. And so there's a portion, though, of Christians who are resilient in this Babylon-like culture that we're living in now, this digital Babylon. And so David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock, the authors, identify one of these traits of the resilient disciples of Christ. And they say, when isolation and mistrust are the norms, forge meaningful intergenerational relationships. Okay, what this does is that those relationships, when they're meaningful, they build trust and they become based in trust, and it can pass down a legacy of, in this case, Christianity, and it can be something where they're learning. Christianity is a religion in a lot of ways of learning, is a belief system in a lot of ways of learning. Christians don't ever believe that they've learned all there is to learn about God or about the world, and so there's always this learning that's taken place. And so I think there's a lot that teachers can learn about relationships with students from this book, Faith for Exiles, here. In particular, this point that students oftentimes feel isolated and they have a hard time trusting people. Those are the norms of our society. But through feedback, we can begin to forge meaningful intergenerational relationships with our students. But it doesn't just happen in a one-off instance. We can maximize the relational output of the feedback we provide through being faithful to being faithful to our students, being faithful to uh, our learners. David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock put it as being a faithful friend. I think it's worth rephrasing here to being a faithful teacher. And that happens by being consistent in the feedback we provide. I always try to highlight for them some for the students that they've done well, but also something that needs improving, because I want to be able to hold my students to high expectations. In his book, Redefining Smart, Tom Markham, he identifies that students are only as smart as they believe they are. And so the beliefs about themselves end up limiting their fulfilled intelligence. And so I can, through feedback, over time, being consistent, I can speak the truth that I'm holding them to high expectations, and I believe that they can reach those expectations. And when I'm communicating through video feedback, not just written feedback, but video feedback, what it does is it gives me an extra layer of communication that's typically lost in online feedback or online communication. It's typically lost. The video portion is typically lost. The face-to-face is typically lost. And so if I'm providing video feedback, it allows me to be a little more personable. They can see some gestures of mine. They can see some facial expressions of mine. And it allows me to speak more clearly to them, communicate my expectations more clearly, and communicate to them that I believe them to be smarter than they are, by holding them to a high expectation that they might not think they can achieve now, but I know that they can achieve. If I'm communicating this sort of feedback to them, and I'm giving them opportunities in class to figure out what that feedback is meaning and communicate to them through additional conversation what that feedback's meaning, man, we are creating an opportunity, whether in face or online, like in this case, where learning is going to thrive, because vested learning happens in deep relationship. And so, or deep learning happens in vested relationship, like Aaron Hansen said. So, thank you for listening to this talk on video feedback, particularly the strengths of video feedback for online instruction and online learning. Here are some resources that you can check out that I utilized through this presentation. Thank you.